Most cyclists who buy a carbon bike never do the math. They see the price tag, assume it performs better, and call it value. But the purchase price is only one number in a longer equation, and the cycling industry has a financial interest in making sure you never run the rest of it. There is a truth about steel versus carbon that nobody in a bike shop will volunteer. It has nothing to do with how either material rides. To understand where the steel versus carbon argument actually stands today, you have to go back to how carbon took over in the first place. Steel was the default frame material for nearly a century. Every professional race from the first Tour de France through the 1980s was won on steel. The material was not going anywhere because of a performance failure. It was going somewhere because of marketing. In 1989, Greg LeMond won the Tour de France on an aluminium frame, and the conversation shifted. Then, in 1999, Lance Armstrong rode a Trek 5500 OCLV carbon frame to victory in Paris. Within 5 years, the professional peloton had largely converted. The consumer market followed, as it always does. Carbon became synonymous with serious cycling, and steel became something you rode when you could not afford better. That framing was enormously profitable for the major frame manufacturers, and it was not entirely accurate. The professional peloton lives in a world of team contracts, sponsored equipment, and annual frame replacement. A World Tour rider's carbon frame is a consumable, not an investment. For everyone else, the economics are completely different. The performance narrative and the commercial narrative fused into the same story, and most cycling media, funded in large part by the same manufacturers selling carbon, had no structural incentive to separate them. Here is what the actual weight numbers show. A top-tier Reynolds 853 steel frame, the kind used by respected builders like Slander, Thorn, and custom frame builders across Europe and North America, weighs approximately 1.5 kilograms. A high-end carbon frame from a major manufacturer weighs 700 to 900 grams. The difference is real. Carbon saves somewhere between 600 and 800 grams at the frame level. That is less than 2 pounds. The cycling press tends to present this figure without context. 2 pounds sounds significant until you hold it against the weight of a full water bottle, or the variation in a rider's own body weight between a heavy training week and a race day taper, or the straightforward fact that the average recreational cyclist is not operating within a margin where 600 grams determines the outcome of anything. The number is genuine. The implied consequence of that number, that it meaningfully changes how fast most people ride, is consistently overstated by everyone selling carbon and almost never examined by independent sources with nothing to sell. Reynolds 953, the current flagship steel alloy from the British tube maker, has a tensile strength exceeding 1,750 megapascals. Columbus XCR, the Italian competitor, reaches comparable figures. A skilled builder working with these modern alloys can construct a road frame that competes with mid-range carbon on weight while retaining every advantage steel carries in repairability, longevity, and crashworthiness. In 2010, a consultant anesthetist in the United Kingdom published a randomized controlled trial in the British Medical Journal. He commuted 27 miles round-trip each working day, alternating daily between a 9.5 kilogram carbon bicycle and a 13.5 kilogram steel bicycle for 6 months. The carbon bike was 4 kilograms lighter than the steel one, a gap far larger than most real-world steel versus carbon comparisons, where the difference at the complete bike level is typically 1 to 2 kilograms at most. The result was a journey time difference of approximately 1 minute over 27 miles. The statistical analysis found the result was not significant. The author concluded plainly, the weight advantage of the carbon bicycle did not translate into a meaningful time difference for a non-elite rider over a real commuting route with hills, traffic, and variable conditions. That study appeared in one of the most respected medical journals in the world. It is almost never cited in a bike shop, but it used more rigorous methodology than most cycling journalism, and its core finding, that frame weight matters less than the industry implies for real-world riding, has never been convincingly refuted. The study is a useful reference point, not because it settles the debate, but because it was not conducted by anyone with a frame to sell. But the weight argument is only one part of the picture. The other part is what happens to these materials over time, and that is where the numbers start to matter more than any spec sheet. Steel has an endurance limit. Below a certain stress threshold, steel can theoretically survive infinite load cycles without progressive fatigue failure. This is the material property that allows a 1980s Reynolds 531 frame, properly maintained, to still be rideable today and still command real money on the used market. The oldest steel frames have become collectibles. The oldest carbon frames are landfill. Carbon does not have this property in the same way. The resin matrix that bonds the carbon fibers together is vulnerable to UV degradation, moisture ingress, and accumulated micro-damage from repeated impacts. Exposed to direct sunlight through a south-facing window, the clear coat on a carbon frame begins to show measurable degradation within 2 to 3 years. According to reporting from Cycling Tips, the typical real-world lifespan of most carbon road frames is 6 to 10 years. Well-maintained frames can reach 15 to 20 years, but that requires controlled indoor storage, no significant crash events, and a level of care. Most riders who bought the bike to actually ride cannot consistently maintain across 2 decades. Steel frames, properly maintained, routinely last decades. The oldest steel bicycle frames have been ridden continuously for 50 years. No carbon frame has had that opportunity yet. The material simply ages better under real-world conditions, and that difference in useful life has direct financial consequences that compound over time. And then there is the crash question. This is where the financial calculation becomes impossible to ignore, and where the industry preference for carbon creates a genuine asymmetry that disadvantages the individual rider. A steel frame that takes a fall will typically bend. The damage is visible, honest, and usually local. A skilled frame builder anywhere in the world can repair it using standard welding equipment for somewhere between $50 and a few $100s. The repair is straightforward, and the result is a frame that can be trusted again. A carbon frame that takes a crash is a fundamentally different problem. Carbon does not bend, it fractures, and the fractures are not always visible on the surface. Internal delamination, the separation of carbon fiber layers inside the frame, can occur in a crash without leaving a single visible mark. The frame looks intact. It feels intact at low speed. But under high load, in a sprint or on a fast descent, a delaminated section can fail without warning. The accepted practice after any significant carbon impact is professional inspection, because there is no reliable method to assess internal damage without specialist equipment. A reputable carbon repair facility in the United States charges a minimum of $400 for framework, with $1,000 being the common outcome once color-matched paint and the labor to strip and rebuild the bike are included. Shipping the frame adds another $200 to $400. Total cost to return a crashed carbon frame to reliable condition: easily $1,500 to $2,000. A comparable steel frame, repaired locally, costs a few hundred at most. That is where the argument the industry never makes aloud becomes unavoidable. The total cost of ownership of a carbon frame is substantially higher than it appears at point of sale, and the total cost of ownership of a quality steel frame is lower than its purchase price suggests. A cyclist who buys a $4,000 carbon frame experiences one crash repair in 10 years and replaces the frame at decade's end has spent approximately $5,500 to $6,000 on the frame alone. A cyclist who buys a Reynolds 853 steel frame for $2,000 and rides it for 20 years. With one local weld repair if needed, has spent approximately $2,200 across the same period. Reynolds 853 is an air-hardening, heat-treated chromoly alloy with a tensile strength of 1,225 to 1,400 megapascals. It is an extraordinarily capable engineering material. It is also inexpensive to produce relative to carbon, and because it lasts so long, it reduces the replacement cycle. Carbon frames require proprietary molds, controlled layup processes, and skilled labor. But those costs are recovered through the premium the market accepts and through the replacement frequency that the material's vulnerability to impact quietly encourages. The economics of the manufacturing industry, not the physics of the materials, are the primary reason carbon became the default consumer choice. None of this means carbon is the wrong choice for every rider. For a competitive racer optimizing for every measurable margin over a short competitive career, the stiffness-to-weight characteristics of high-end carbon are genuinely meaningful. For a rider climbing at a professional level, 600 grams at the frame matters at the margin. But for an amateur covering 20 to 60 miles 3 to 5 times per week on public roads, without a support vehicle, the picture changes entirely. The performance gap narrows on real routes with real conditions. The cost gap widens over time. The repairability gap becomes concrete and expensive the first time the frame meets the road. What cyclists keep returning to, in comments sections and forum threads and group ride arguments, is a version of the same frustration. The industry stopped selling the thing that worked and started selling the thing that generated the best replacement cycle. That instinct is not always fair, but it is not entirely unfair either. Steel worked. The argument that it does not work for most riders anymore is mostly a commercial argument wearing a technical disguise. The honest answer about steel versus carbon is not that one material is objectively superior. It is that the choice depends entirely on what you are optimizing for, over what time horizon, and whether the frame manufacturer's marketing budget gets a vote in your decision. Carbon wins in a sprint. Steel wins over a decade. The industry prefers you to sprint. If you want more honest takes on what the cycling industry is selling, hit subscribe and stick around.